as Justin was saying, when we first started talking about participating today, Alex Wood and I were talking about our approach, and we're not brand consultants, so brand has kind of appeared in our work, I suppose, somewhat unexpectedly. But I was also thinking, and I was chatting to the studio about technology and computers, and telling them that when I was at college, there weren't any computers, and in fact, in my first job, I had a drawing board on my desk. They look at me like I'm a dinosaur. So it made me think about actually how I ended up doing what I do. So the first part of what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of looking back over my path. I decided to be a graphic designer when I saw the powers of 10 when I was 14, and have been kind of fairly obsessed and driven by design and typography ever since. So I thought I would look back, and when I first started at RISD in the 80s, we were in letterpress, and there were no computers, as I said, and in my final year in 91, a few Macs started to arrive. And I can remember feeling that it was sort of too late for me at that point. They looked like these kind of scary boxes, and I was very much about letterpress and typography. But it was a frightening concept because I was suddenly leaving with this new way of approaching design and producing it appearing. Actually, through preparing to do this, I looked back and found some old college studies. Sorry, I photographed them outside my house. But actually what was exciting and what I was thankful for was the fact that I ended up making things with my hands. So in effect, without having to deal with learning about computer programs, I really felt like I left college as a maker. I went home, sorry, there's a few more. I think it was about drawing and thinking about line and obsessing with the idea of line and type. And my first job was at Pentagram in London, and our group were responsible for editorial design. So again, when I look at these were done with a drawing board on our desk with ruling pens and a lot of time in a dark room. But what I was learning was the idea that the color gray on a printed page, and how you could create different colors and different tones was all about the space we were putting between letters and letter forms. So I left Pentagram and set up my own studio, and my first client was Tate. And at that time there was only one Tate in Tate, now called Tate Britain, but Tate Modern was appearing. And again, it was this terrifying leap of, instead of working with, say, 400 or 500 words on a page, I was putting sort of one on a wall and talking to architects, and to be honest, really had no idea what I was doing, but it kind of opened up a whole new dimension to design and a passion for the fact that you could take something and put one word on a wall and the human connections that you could make. And I guess at that point I was beginning to realize that maybe my relationship with brand could have kind of an impact on places and spaces. In a way, it felt like the handmade education that I'd had at RISD had kind of been the perfect preparation for that. We had some amazing teachers, and one of them was a lady called Inga Druckery, who was a typography teacher. And I went on YouTube and looked back at some recent things that she's put together. And I have a video of sort of student projects, the sorts of things that she used to make us do. But one of the first things she did was make us draw our name for 8 hours once a week for 4 months in different typefaces. And I think that was when we really sort of learned about the passion for type and letter spacing and typography, which I sort of go on and on about in our work. So I wrote down a few quotes that she said, that the sort of thing that she used to say to us. Graphic design is seeing and envisaging. The eye has to move around enjoyably with nothing where you get stuck. It all flows and works together with nothing unnecessary. It's about attraction and simplification. Stare at things and see what's there. What does the space tell you? So when Justin first got in touch with us about talking today, and this idea about playing with brands or being playful with brands, I sort of thought at first that sounded like we were messing with them in the wrong way, maybe. And actually, in discussion with the studio, that maybe more of what we do is playing with a brand. We're not brand consultants, but we sort of work in spaces and influence places that people visit. We work a lot in museums and understand how the effect of something as a museum operates, how it looks, how it behaves, in a way is our idea of the sort of concept of brand and people in spaces. A brand, this is the Welcome collection that's just opened. I guess when we set up Holmes Wood in 2000 with Alex, it was about bringing together the discipline of graphic design and wayfinding, which was kind of an idea of organization and identity design. And I think, as Simon said from Populous, we were so excited when we met SEGD about 10 years ago, because in the UK, we don't really have this kind of community. But our work has sort of evolved into wayfinding, working how people move around a space, the environment, and then formalizing findings into a scheme that brings all of those elements together, whether it's digital or collaborating with landscape, lighting, furniture, color, and even architecture. So following this logic, for any visitor environment, we form our ideas around the principle of helping people to feel comfortable with a place by evoking an emotional response to a rational structure. We try to cultivate a feeling of belonging. So what you're not giving someone, hassle, frustration, or bemusement, but what you are giving them, warmth, effortless understanding, and distinctive experiences. So we try to aim for people to say they've enjoyed a space, but they're not quite sure why, but they genuinely create a kind of an emotional and rational response to an environment. I'm also interested in John Mader, and this is something that he says. So there's an important trade-off between being comfortably lost in the unknown and completely found in the familiar. Too familiar can have the positive aspect of making complete sense, which to some can seem boring. Too unknown can have the negative connotations of danger, which to some can seem a thrill. Thus, there is a trade-off between found versus lost. We tend to think in terms of trying to create an environment where people feel comfortably lost. And I was talking to my father about this the other day, and he said, how can a word lost ever be a positive thing? But actually, when we're working in a museum, we want you to not really notice what we do. We want you to find your way around, have a great time, see beautiful things, and feel sort of supported. When we work with an airline, we don't want you to feel comfortably lost at all. So what we're trying to do is introduce the mundane but important, finding the loo or the exit, but also have an impact on a space. We might shout a bit when we want to stop or direct you or pause you. The other factor that usually with all of our projects is part of the brief is that they have to be relevant for at least 20 to 25 years, especially when you're working in a museum. So in a way, there's a lot of place for play and wit, but there's no place for trendy, and we have to be timeless in our work. So I've sort of talked a bit generally about what we do. I'd like to talk about two projects. I picked this because this is Winston Churchill, and he often used to make this sign of peace. Sometimes he would turn it the other way around. But he used to say, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. And in a way, I think that's part of what we're talking about today. So the first of my V signs is the V&A Museum in London. And this is a brand mark that Alan Fletcher, one of the founding Pentagram partners, designed in the 80s. It stands for everything the museum's about, which I think is design, craft, and excellence. The museum's objects is like a visual encyclopedia. The breadth of the collection is world-renowned, from shoes to tapestry, architecture, ironwork. You can immerse yourself for days, and I think it's not a surprise that so many famous designers cite the V&A as an inspiration for their work. But when Alan Fletcher's new mark was introduced, it was only really used in marketing, but it didn't really get expressed in the museum itself. When Moira Gemmell arrived at the V&A in 2002, she had a vision to bring the logo and extended it throughout the museum. After a pretty rigorous tendering process, as a very young and small company, we were appointed to work with Moira to create a new wayfinding scheme to be spread throughout the entire museum. It had never happened before, and for those of you who don't know the museum, it's 7.5 miles of corridor over 7 levels in 6 buildings that were never intended to connect. So we were a new studio. It was a fairly interesting learning curve. But what we had to do was inform an intelligent understanding of the space and the brand and what Moira was trying to project, and try to introduce it into a coherent environmental experience. The V&A brand is about the virtues of understanding design and style, we thought, maybe a bit museum-y and aloof, but our approach has been to take that as a stake in the ground and add wit, helpfulness, and ease of experience. So I don't want to talk too much about what we did, but briefly, the first thing that struck us was that the museum galleries were named in ways that were very confusing to the visitor. So we approached the head of the curatorial team and asked if we could rename all of the galleries, which we did. And there are 4 underlying themes to the collection. So we introduced the name of a theme and its color. And then the toolkit became a very simple toolkit of a room number that was always visible, the name of each gallery on every threshold, and the theme code presented on every threshold. There are 26 different lifts and stairs in the V&A. So we spent months trying to figure out how to cope with that, and what we decided to do was to name all of them and bravely only tell you what you can access through that piece of vertical circulation. We designed the first map that had ever connected the whole museum and kept directional signs to an absolute minimum. We worked very closely with the staff, and as you know, probably all of you who work in a museum, the staff become the third element of the toolkit for us, really. It's the staff, signs, and a map. It took us a year from start to finish. And for those of you who met Moira, she didn't take no for an answer, so you had to keep moving things forward. People always ask these days about how you measure success. They used to get hundreds of letters of complaint about people getting lost, and suddenly the letters stopped, and people were starting to experience the museum in a completely different way. In a way, what we had done was to trigger this idea that the museum was sort of falling back in love with itself, and all of the museum, every room, every corridor. And in a way, it sent a message that the V&A was ready to become, I think, what it is today, an outstanding museum of design and art. And what we were hoping to achieve was this idea that people would start to visit the V&A out of passion and not out of a sense of duty, which I think they had previously. So I turn to my second V sign. This is the work we've done with Virgin Atlantic. Apart from connecting London with Los Angeles, what had happened was one of the senior members of the V&A, the Virgin Atlantic team, had visited the V&A. They'd done it often, but they went home and noticed that they had had a much better time, and actually as a family had had a much better day out. He was so taken with the change in the experience that he rang the museum and asked them what had happened, and that led him to ringing us. And I took the call, and the first question was, have you ever worked with an airline? And I was wondering what the right answer was, because we were praying that it would be the right answer. Anyway, I said no, and he said, that's great, come and see us. So since then, we have worked on 2 different projects with Virgin Atlantic. First of all, helping to design with Foster's Architects the new T3 terminal at Heathrow. When I say new, this is kind of 2007. And I think the second was the creation of a global signs manual that we've been working on the last few years, which basically wherever Virgin present themselves, whether it's a busy terminal in New York or a desk for 4 hours in Nairobi, creating the toolkit that gets expressed in those spaces. And what we found with working with them was that in a way they were doing the complete opposite to the V&A. It was all about brand, and it was all about being cheeky, and it was not very clear and inclusive, certainly for international travel. So we embarked on a journey of working with a brand that's probably one of the most playful. And doing design guidelines like this is something that they had never looked at. Because if you look, this is Richard Branson, who's the head of Virgin Atlantic, who thinks nothing of dressing up in drag to launch a new product. So this was great, but what we were trying to do was saying there's a time and a place for marketing yourselves in this way. But there are also times when you can have wit in your expression, but there's also times when actually communicating more professionally in the built environment and having a much more grown-up and clear and reorganized system of communication for travelers. One of the things we found was that although once you get on the plane you had an amazing experience, it all had become too playful, and in a way the playful had taken over from practical. They had the worst record for getting passengers on the planes because actually they were just too nice to them. So what we were doing was about playing with the rules of their brand, but creating distinctive work and reinforcing it beyond the rules. Their brand color is red, and it was everywhere. And what we were trying to say was, if you put red everywhere, you're just adding to the stress of your passengers, because people traveling are mostly overexcited, frightened, sad. They're always at the heightened end of the spectrum of emotion. So the glowing red terminals around the world were just adding to this stress of their passengers. So we started to introduce quite a sort of low-key, clearer, introducing international icons they had never used before, and trying to say that there's a time and a place for being funny, and there's a time and a place for actually just taking a brand. And this is us trying to figure out whether the fin of the logo should be three-dimensional, and talking to them about its structure, and creating some of the parts with some of the fantastic fabricators, and presenting their brand on buildings around the world. So what I hope is that I've shown that by taking 2 totally different projects, one where everything about the V&A was screaming to be taken more seriously and helping to change that experience, and the other where Virgin Atlantic didn't need to express its brand in the way that it was in the built environment. My last slide is a little bit of brand play. I hope you'll forgive me for. Thank you very much.